Okay. Bonjour et bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Nous sommes heureux de vous accueillir à la 6e session d'atelier de la série Boîte à outils en sciences humaines numériques. Je suis Jada Watson, coordonnatrice de sciences humaines numériques à la Faculté des Arts de l'Université d'Ottawa. Good morning and welcome to the 6th session of the DH Toolbox series. I'm Jada Watson, coordinator of digital humanities in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Ottawa. Before we begin today, I'd like to start our session with an Indigenous land affirmation. Nous rendons hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de cette terre. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date, l'unissant à ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons également hommage à tous les peuples autochtones qui habitent Ottawa, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. Nous reconnaissons les gardiens des savoirs traditionnels jeunes et âgés. Nous honorons aussi le courageux dirigeants d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et de demain. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge their traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Agribusinesses are among the oldest oligopoly corporations in the world, and their concentration gives them an advantage over the other food system actors. In today's Toolbox session, Dr. Kelly Bronson will discuss with us what happens when big data get caught up in pre-existing arrangements of power. Her richly ethnographic account details the work of corporate scientists, farmers using the data, and activist hackers building open source data platforms. Despite divergent views on whom technology is for, how it should be developed, and what kinds of agriculture it should support, actors in private and public contexts share ways of speaking about data and its value for the future. Here today to speak with us about this framework for imagining big data and what it might do for society is Dr. Kelly Bronson. Dr. Bronson holds a Canada Research Chair in Science and Society here at the University of Ottawa in Canada, where she studies the societal and ethical dimensions of controversial technologies and their governance, from GMOs to big data. Today's talk is drawn from Dr. Bronson's recent book, which is right here, maybe backwards to you. The Immaculate Conception of Data, Agribusiness, Activists, and Their Shared Politics of the Future. We're thrilled to have her here with us today to learn more about her work and celebrate the publication of this book. Before I turn the podium and screen over, I'd just like to remind everyone to keep their cameras and microphones muted for the duration of the presentation. We'll hold all questions at the end, at which point I'll invite you to enter your questions in the chat and I'll facilitate that discussion for you. So now it's my great honor to welcome my colleague, Dr. Kelly Bronson.
Thank you, Jada. There we go. Hey, thank you so much for inviting me to present to the DH Toolkit. Honored to be here, excited to be here. Thanks to all of you online and thanks to my audience here in person. I'm going to speak hopefully just for about 30 minutes to leave lots of time for questions and discussion. And I'm going to talk about this new book, which is called The Immaculate Conception of Data, and it's about big data and AI used in agriculture, but it's also about ways of imagining and talking about big data and AI, what they are and what they can do for society. And that's the Immaculate Conception framework. So I'm going to try and do both things in this talk today, talk about both of those aspects of the book. So on the one hand, the book, as I said, is about practices around of data science and computer science expertise happening across various domains of expertise, from private sector scientists and private sector labs to farm fields where activists are playing with AI, do-it-yourself technologies and platforms. But just to back up a little bit for those of you who may not have known that big data and AI are being applied in the domain of agriculture, I wanted to, using this screen capture from John Deere, the manufacturer of the big green tractor, they have a suite of digital technologies that they use. And so they visualize a lot of the computational and digital tools used in farming, which is a helpful overview for those of you new to this, to thinking about this sort of use case for big data and AI. So, you may not have known before, but every new John Deere tractor is embedded with hundreds of sensors. And from the moment that farmer opens the cab door, just like from the moment you engage on social media, data are collected. There are data on the equipment itself. So the functioning of the equipment, the fuel usage, for example, and efficiency, but also data on the laborer, the farmer or other farm laborer, and then data about the farm environment. So soil pH and moisture, crop. And then those data are combined by corporations that like John Deere with remote and near sensing. So in this image, you'll also see pictured a drone or an unmanned aeronautic vehicle, but also their farm level data are combined with public data sets, for example, on weather, climate data. And then all the data from a tractor are fed to cloud-based infrastructure just passively. So a continuous collection of data points, again, very much analogous to our behavior online when data are harvested without our awareness. And then the data are aggregated into what's called big data sets. And then they're mined or so-called mined by intelligent machines or machine learning. And then insights on how best to manage the farm are sold back to the farmer. So just a bit of an overview. And this suite of technologies is called different things by industry, by academics. One of the umbrella terms is precision agriculture, but it is actually mostly used in reference to the equipment that collects the data. Another umbrella term is digital agriculture or the smart farm or even agriculture 4.0. And that phraseology actually relates to the main argument of my book, and we'll get there. So as I said, the book kind of operates on two levels, and I wanted to do a quick tour of both of the levels today. We'll see if we get through that. But one of the things I wanted to do with the book was really trace, as Jada said, ethnographically. So with a lot of time spent with experts and scientists, farmers playing in this space, I wanted to know what was happening, what data were being collected, where were they, how were they moving, right? Were data being transferred by John Deere, for example, to other agricultural businesses? The answer is yes on that one. Who was finding value or creating value in the data? What kinds of value for whom? So this was kind of following from, right, all of the attention with both scholarly and publicly that has been given to big data and the uses, but also the misuses, right, of data sets in other sectors like social media, health, finance, insurance. So, following from all the great work, and I'm thinking of really well-known and great books like Sophia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression or Kathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction. Yeah, the books. Following from all that great work, I wondered what was happening in the context of agriculture, food production. Because there wasn't, when I started the book in 2017, there wasn't all that much work in this space. And there still is relatively a lot less. So that's what I tried to do. Now, as a kind of first finding, because I think it's a finding in and of itself, doing that work that I tried to do, following the data or figuring out which data were being collected and what was being done with them and who was, say, monetizing them or creating other kinds of value from the data was a really difficult thing to do. I had a hard time accessing scientists working within the private sector, in many cases because they were themselves protected by trade secrecy law, right? And even if I said, I'm a social scientist and I'm interested or I'm concerned about social justice, right? I don't care about trade secrets and I'm not going to try to build my own technology, proprietary technology. There was still a lot of suspicion, and in many cases, people were not able or free to speak. So that was difficult. And then the data sets themselves, at least those collected by the private sector, are protected by legal mechanisms like copyright and intellectual property law. As well, the algorithms that use the big data sets, the farm level data, to generate advice for farmers are obfuscated by legal mechanisms. And I think that's a finding in and of itself, so it's worth mentioning, because, how can we, well, first of all, how can we validate these tools, right? How can we know if they work and in doing what they say they will do? And I'm going to describe in a bit what what proponents say they will do. But how can we know they'll say what they do if we don't know how they work, right? How do we know if they work if we can't know how they work? As just one, but more from a sociological, which is my domain perspective, right? How can we do the kind of critical work that's needed to engender justice via technological change if we can't peek behind the curtain, right? Or the legal scholar Frank Pascal calls this a black box, algorithmic black box. And so very much in the context of agriculture, I found the data sets and even the expertise to be a pernicious black box. So I kind of had to change my strategy methodologically a little bit. And what I then did after I found it a bit difficult to speak with people and to access original data sets or peek behind the curtain is I decided to go to conventions where data enthusiasts, mostly from industry, were attending, because there I found that people, especially over coffee, were willing to speak freely and enthusiastically. I donned a suit. I had to kind of perform an insider tech perspective. There was an interesting gender thing that happened in that, and I write about it in the book. But so I did that. I also went to legal documents. So I decided, well, if maybe I can actually turn this into a data set itself. So I read the terms of use, the license agreements, and then I also read financial documentation and public reporting. Okay. So based on all of these sources of evidence, and I detail the sources of evidence in the book, but I am able to make a few claims, and I won't get into very many of them, but I will just sort of flag that I've actually summarized a few of them in this 850-word piece that I wrote for the conversation last summer. And I love the conversation because it really presses you to be accessible as an academic, and it is only 850 words. So if you're interested in some of the things that especially private sector or agribusiness, we call it, right? Agricultural companies like John Deere are doing with data, and then some of the dangers, as this title implies, vis-a-vis environmental and social justice, they're summarized in this article. But I'm going to talk about a few of them. Oh, I will say as well, kind of overarching. So one of the overarching claims is that, and a finding in and of itself, is that the data are obfuscated as well, or like the people are as well, by legal agreements, which is a problem, I think. But another overarching claim is that it became clear in reading the financial documents and in going to these conventions that that former input supply companies, we call it in agriculture. So these are companies that supply farmers inputs, farm inputs, and that can be machinery, it can be fuel, or seeds and chemicals, for example. These companies are pivoting toward data as a source of value or revenue. It's clear in the financial reporting, and they say as much explicitly, and I have quotations in the book. So I think that's another overarching thing just to be aware of, that I was curious. Sometimes I say to people, the tagline for the book is, Monsanto is a new Facebook or an emerging Facebook. But it was really a curiosity when I began the book is, right, are agribusinesses emerging data companies? And I think the answer is yes. So that's it. But I'm going to get into a few of the specific things that I am able to say about what's happening with data. So, one of the things that one can say, even looking at the surface level, Ian Bogost, the humanities scholar, I think, he calls it the rhetoric, right, of an algorithm. So even looking just like at the interface level, not at the data or how the algorithm was coded, you can see that there, just like that we've been able to say, or scholars have been able to say, that there are biases in algorithms, for example, like Google search, right? There's a racial bias in large part because of the data which feed the algorithm. We can see a similar sort of sorting bias, I think, in relation to agriculture. And here's just one example, and it's on the slide. But even if you look at the superficial level, at the commercially available decision support platforms, it's called, these are the AI tools for farmers. If you look even just at the data sets that are being generated, the only data that are of interest to these corporations, so the decision support platforms are designed around data collected only on what's called agronomic crops. These are commodity crops like soy, corn, right? Typically grown on large acreage farms with more access to capital that buy the expensive new machinery or pieces of equipment, and that farm food, but often it's feedstock for export. So this is a particular style or farm strategy. Sometimes you might call it like industrial farming. And so the tools that are being generated are really only being designed for this type of farmer, which means that I think that's a kind of, it's not the same, obviously, as a racial or a gender bias in a search algorithm, but it does mean that the sort of technology by design is fostering only a particular kind of farm operator, because there aren't comparable decision support tools for the smaller and biodiverse farms. So that's just one finding that I talk about in the book, and I have lots of others. In the book, I trace various sources of various routes, I guess, for data being collected on farm and the ways in which value is created from the data. And there are really three kind of broad buckets. One is that it's clear that the data sets themselves, because I've found evidence that the data are being sold. Just like we know, right? Facebook sells data sets mostly for targeted marketing, right? For firms wanting to sell us jeans, washing machines, makeup, right? So the data sets are in agriculture are, I think, equally valuable as an asset in and of themselves. They're being assetized and they're being transferred, say, between John Deere and the seed and chemical manufacturer Monsanto. But another source of value is that, and we know that agricultural companies have done this historically. You know, when I talk to farmers in North America, farmers say, I'm a deer man, which is a bit sexist language, but mostly this is men we're talking about statistically in Canada. You know, and so if you have a kind of, one has a kind of close relationship, right, with a John Deere dealer and with the John Deere manufacturer over history. And we know that agricultural companies have courted these close relationships. Some scholars talk about it as relationships of dependence, right, on particular agribusinesses and agricultural inputs. And I see the same thing happening with data. So there are incentive programs around the precision agricultural decision support tools, right? If you use one company's tool, you get a certain rebate over so many acres, like 50 cents an acre. And then the tools themselves, as one would expect, right? The decision support algorithm, it is known to only recommend products, obviously, that are within the portfolio of the ecosystem of that company. And so, I mean, that's just another. So that's one way, I think, of generating value, is to continue these relationships of dependence, we might call it, between farmers and particular agribusinesses and technological strategies. And then the last one is the data, I think, are being used by third parties to sell things, right? But also maybe even not input suppliers. So, for example, insurance companies. When farmers lose, not insurance companies, but reinsurance companies, those who insure the insurance companies, often profit handsomely. So these are companies that buy blocks of loss and gamble on them. And one can only imagine, right, that the predictive analytics enabled by big data and AI will give, right, a kind of predictive capacity, right, to allow companies themselves to hedge, but also third parties like insurance companies. So that's just a quick tour of some of the things that I say in the book. Okay, but there's a second level at which the book operates, and that is about practices of imagination and speech surrounding big data and AI. And I found, this was a surprising finding, actually. And what I found was a pervasive, ideologically versatile, and widespread, pervasive way that participants with whom I engaged in writing the book talked about big data and AI. And this is the framework in the book that I call the Immaculate Conception of Data. It forms the title, but I didn't set out to write a book about a framework or ways of imagining or practices of imagination and speech. I set out with actually a pretty simple research design, which I think is interesting for if there are any students in attendance. I can't see who's attending, but I thought informed a little bit by a science and technology studies perspective that sees the context of scientific practice as relevant for the knowledge that's produced or the technology that's produced, a social construction of technology perspective. I thought, well, I knew that there were really interesting things happening by small scale farmers, mostly aimed at local food systems in open contexts of innovation, using open source platforming, copyright commons with big data and AI. And then I knew, of course, there was the stuff happening that was led by the private sector, like the John Deere's around digital farming and Ag 4.0. And I thought, I'll just look, there may be these two models for the realization of digital agriculture. And maybe they won't look the same, right? The technologies won't look the same. The users won't be the same. And I had this pretty neat, perhaps too neat comparative study design. And then what I found after 2 years of spending time with folks in these two places, especially after systematically coding, right, or thematically analyzing my field data, what I found is that everyone was participating, despite differences, everyone was participating in a way of talking about big data and AI. Okay, so let me first really quickly sketch these two different kind of models for the realization of the future. And very much a part of the framework of the Immaculate Conception is this casting toward the future. Everyone is really hoping and looking toward the future and technology-led social change to redesign the food system, but in different ways. So you have this one model, which is the John Deere model, right? And it's the private sector model for the realization of the future. In 2012, John Deere released this odd video because it's not a commercial. In 2012, it was the case that these technologies did not exist, and many of them still do not exist. And the company asked this question and they posted this video film on social media. How will technology change the future of farming? And you can see the answer that they give in this film, right? It's clear. And this is a projection shared. And in the book, I detail other sites for this view or model for the realization of the future of agriculture. But it's shared among powerful agribusinesses, not just John Deere, right? But say Bayer, Monsanto as well. And so what's the vision? Well, you get a sense of it, right, from this video already. But the vision is really that agricultural digitalization, the incorporation of tools for gathering data, for aggregating data, and then mining those data, right? Using AI will catapult farmers, right, from labor, from the sort of material conditions of farm labor, from their muddy boots, I say on this slide, into the creative economy. Right. So farming is projected to become an increasingly abstracted enterprise, not just in terms of the actual labor. So if I had let the video play longer, it shows a farmer exiting a tractor, right? So the tractor is a driverless or fully autonomous vehicle. So not just in terms of labor through automation, for example, robotics, which I actually realized I didn't mention in the beginning, but also the sort of insight, right? Intellectually, that farming will become abstracted, where farm decisions will be replaced by artificial intelligence, right? That artificial intelligence is thought to be so superior in terms of the volume, right? And it's just in its speed and capacity that it will outstrip the potential of any individual farm labor. Interestingly, even though I said the Immaculate Conception of Data and this vision for the future of farming is casting toward the future, in the book, I try to historicize this vision of the future, because actually this projection, right, that farming will become increasingly abstracted, laborless, right, and that new technologies will not just reduce the arduous nature of farm labor, but also give each farmer a competitive advantage over their neighbor. These are the very same arguments that have attended the promotion of every historic agricultural technology, if one looks throughout history, from Jethro Tull's seed drill. So there's a bit of history in this idea of the future. Okay, but there's actually an additional projection. And in the book, I use a science studies concept called socio-technical imaginaries, which the socio-technical, the hyphen, is meant to indicate, right, that technical change is never at once technical change, it's always social. But it's also that in imaginations of technology, especially those held among powerful actors, and in the food system, who would that be? That's industry, but also policymakers, right? That these projections really matter because they set sort of the course for how technologies then come to be materialized, given what technologies get funded, for example, or adopted, right? The arguments matter. And the socio-technical imaginaries concept is also also suggests that claims about technology are almost always claims not about the technical capacity or superiority of a new technology or an innovation, but they're often also moral claims making, right? So they're claims that this technology will not just be technically superior, but it will deliver, right, wider moral or social good. And we really see that as an element of this one vision for the future of farming, what in the book I call the kind of dominant, because it's shared among the really powerful and dominant actors. So here's just an example. On World Food Day in 2020, the head of Monsanto's digital agricultural program said, the world's population is growing, the amount of farmland arable farmland is shrinking, absolutely true claims. Agricultural productivity will need to increase to safeguard our food supply. Digitalization of farming can help us deploy our resources efficiently, sustainably, enabling farmers to get the best out of their fields with minimal environmental impact. So you can see the sort of the breadth, right, of this claims making. And this is a claim that's made by academics as well. So I also do a survey in the book of the academic literature, the technical literature. And, in 2004, an early article on digital agriculture described the use of these tools as paradigmatic in terms of a paradigm shift, right? This was going to fully revolutionize farm or food production by substituting environmental information for physical inputs. So there's a sustainability claim, a productivity claim that's being made, and they're about wider social good, like feeding, right, a global population. Okay. Okay, so I don't have time to get into this too much. So then I'm going to pivot by showing you this other, what I started out with as the other kind of, right, in lots of ways, completely diametrically opposed model for the vision of the realization of digital agriculture, or the future of agriculture under these technologies. And this is one shared by farmers operating in hacktivist workshops on agroecological and organic farms in the US and Canada, both in Ontario, and I spend most time in Canada with a group in Quebec called CAPE. And, if the dominant vision for the future of digitized food production is characterized by a conspicuous absence of the farmer, right? So the promise and the projection is that the hands-on labor have been replaced, and also, right, their intellectual labor has been replaced. This other sort of model for the realization of digital agriculture imagines actually that these innovations are taking shape led by farmers. So this is farmer-led innovation in hands-on sites of like tool building, even though they're digital tools, right? And the innovation is aimed at local contexts of food production or local food system in these tool building, community building kind of social movement formations. So you can see how it's very different. And actually, so most of the, in the US, most of the farmers who operate in this space are organized around this online platform. It is meant to be a kind of counterpart to the commercial tools. So John Deere's decision support platform that I showed with the screenshot from their website at the beginning is called Farm Command. This is, My Farm Manager. Farm Command is from a Canadian company called Farmers Edge. But this is meant to compete, but again, it's written on GitHub, it's subject to copyright commons, it's all open source. So it's volunteer coders, many of whom actually are farmers. It's called FarmOS. The head of FarmOS, Doran Cox, told me that with FarmOS, we're able to have democratized access to environmental data. So anybody has access to high quality, high resolution data at a low cost, and we have high participation. One volunteer coder who I spoke with, who works in Silicon Valley for her day job, moonlights as a volunteer and with this group. And she told me what we care about is this idea of the shared commons, right? Whether it's thinking about shared information, shared sources of community building, right? Open data, open innovation. And she said that actually she described, right, in building these open tools, we're also at once building a resilient or open food system. So this like tool building again as in kind of environmental and food system activism. Okay. So there were differences. So I set out with that simple research design, and in some ways it, what I found stuck with that, matched what I initially, I guess, hypothesized or imagined was going to be the case. That in the private-led context of innovation, there was a particular ethos shared by scientists, as well as like those high up in industry, those I was able to speak with, right, around data, a particular technical ethos, right, data restriction. And actually, the data restriction was justified by scientists in the private sector on a number of fronts that seemed on one level quite reasonable, right? If you fall within this ethos. So for example, data scientists working in industry said, farmers are busy. They're busy managers, because imagine their farmer they're aiming their technologies toward is a farmer farming thousands of acres, right? They're a business person, actually, in some ways more than a farmer. And so they said, farmers are busy. We need to sort of have very specialized in-house data expertise and restricted access to data because farmers don't want the data anyway. And to be honest, I spoke with farmers for the book. I traced these imaginaries onto the farm. And by and large, the farmers buying the commercially available tools sold by companies like John Deere, they actually share in this ethos. They agreed, yes, absolutely. We're happy to pay a company. I don't want access to my raw data. Right? It was also that the data restriction was justified, especially in the legal agreements, when I analyzed those, as a way to protect farmer privacy. So there was this sort of justification around data restriction as a way to protect individual farmer privacy, and then actually even broader security. There's an ethos around, right, what type of farming that these tools are aimed towards. So an agricultural vision of what is good agriculture. In fact, I asked scientists working in private sector and the public sector, what's good agriculture to you? And the head of a large Canadian precision agricultural company told me, the CEO, he said, good farms, go big and grow corn. So, right, it's about getting bigger, outcompeting your neighbors, and growing commodity crops. That's the vision of good farm, and that's what they're developing their tools for. Remember that point I made at the beginning about bias. And yeah, so, and then on the activist side, again, you have these open contexts for open science, open data sharing, copyright commons, everything is shared, right? The vision of good agriculture is sustainable, as in defined as biodiverse and smaller scale, facing a locally resilient and more local food system. So you have these totally different visions of good technology design, and good science and good agriculture. And yet, both of these models frame data as the solution to food system problems. So that's one element of the Immaculate Conception. They also all cast toward the future, right? But the Immaculate Conception is really a bit more, and you might be able to infer based on the title or the wording, right? That what these participants really shared was a way of describing data as if it were agential, right? Delivering social change. And also as if data and then the algorithms using those data were unmediated by human actors. So, right, even in the phrasing data-driven or raw data, and I unpack a lot of this phrasing in the book, and I trace the history of these phrases to discourses around the early internet. And for those of you interested in humanities research on internet technologies more broadly, that appears in the book. But, so other scholars, I want to sort of clarify what the Immaculate Conception of Data is not. I started to see that the Immaculate Conception of Data is not a specious kind of heuristic, or it's not distorted epistemics, right? I knew that the people that I interviewed wouldn't hold true to the premises of Immaculate Conception of Data if I asked them, and I did, right? And that was in part because these were the very same people who showed me, right, in fields, in laboratories, the labor that they were doing that was required to bring these data sets into being, right? They were the humans behind the data collection, behind the structuring and weighting of a data set, and the infrastructure building and the writing of algorithms. So of course they wouldn't hold true to the premise that data are raw or unpeopled, right? But yet they were talking about, consistently, everyone was talking about data in this way. So I started to realize that, right, the Immaculate Conception of Data is actually a performance, right? It has what in sociology we might call a kind of social life or a social force, right? It's a framework that works. It's a rhetorical strategy, probably unconscious. And so this is what I think is unique about the framework, because other scholars have talked about cultural fantasies around data and AI. I mentioned Ian Bogost before. He has an article in The Atlantic called The Cathedral of Computation. He's talked about this. The really well-known data studies scholar, Kate Crawford, talks about data fundamentalism, right? A near religious view that people have on data, or belief that data are objective, she calls it. I do something slightly different with the Immaculate Conception of Data. Rather than just describing, right, that people hold this view and describing it or unpacking it as a false way of looking, I really show in the book how it's a really useful way of describing one's data science project, right? That I really show that, an activist using the Immaculate Conception of Data to describe their project to me in a farm field on a windy spring day in Quebec won me over to their data science project, right? That this view written into a funding bid for a huge pot of funding from the Canadian Superclusters Fund, is a win. It ended up being a winning strategy. So I trace the efficacy of the Immaculate Conception of Data. And what I do in the book theoretically is I use science and technology studies scholarship to really show that historically, as many STS scholars have shown, that talking about technology or talking about a scientific fact as if it dropped from the sky, right? As if it were found and not made, right? As if a scientist were disinterested, has conferred a notion of objectivity on the technology or the fact. And it's been a really powerful way of framing one's project, including the colonial project or early industrialism. So I show using theory and historical example that this is actually a really winning strategy. Okay, and I'm just going to give just two examples of the Immaculate Conception of Data at work. But just to say, so the Immaculate Conception of Data in the book, I really intended as a meeting ground between critical data study scholarship, like that of Kate Crawford and Ian Bogost, and science studies, because science studies can really help us unpack the link between data's perceived rawness and the social force. And I think that's the unique thing. Okay, so just and of course, in calling the book and the framework, the Immaculate Conception of Data, I pull on multiple cultural threads, right, that find their expression, I think, in this new way of talking, including the religious, right? Because just like Mary's conception of Jesus, right, a kind of cleanliness, or Donna Haraway in science studies calls it the scientist's God trick, right? As if a fact just existed, as if data were just put there, right? Or God just put Jesus, right, in the body of Mary. The Immaculate Conception of Data has a similar kind of efficacy in bringing power to, like has been brought to the scientist or to God. Okay, so Oh, so just two examples. So this was a conversation I had with Tim, who's an agribusiness scientist, works for a smaller company in this space, using data visualization and visual computing and drone technology for weed management. And Tim said to me, the human reading of data is not scalable. Information doesn't play into the big picture. So if our system sees a viral plant, it sees all the viral plants and it knows, right? So again, describing, right, personifying the system and describing it as agential or knowledgeable, right? Omniscient and therefore omnipotent. Here's just one more example. So this was a conversation I had with a public sector scientist who does crop mapping across Canada for the Canadian government. And this person told me in her windowless office in late afternoon, we know every field in the country. We know what's growing in it. It could be the soil, and it's so powerful just to know, right? So again, just an indication of the social force of that belief, right? Or at least the way of thinking and speaking about data as unpeopled. Okay, and I witnessed the social force and I gave you some examples, but despite its force, in the end, in the last chapter in the book, I make the argument that the Immaculate conception of data is a hazardous framework. Leo Marx has this great essay, Technology as a Hazardous Concept, and so I'm alluding to that here. It's a hazardous way of imagining and describing what big data and AI are and their relationship to society. And for a bunch of reasons, but I'll just mention one. At most basic, it obfuscates, right, the people who are behind the creation of the data. And if you're not thinking about people as actually creating or fabricating data and writing algorithms, then you can't really see, right, that with those people come particular sets of interests. I don't mean bias, I just mean partiality, right? Because people are going to be situated in particular contexts, right? So for example, of course, the agribusinesses are designing their precision agricultural tools for the large scale commodity grower. I had one industry scientist say to me, of course we do that. They're our bread and butter, right? That's the market. And that's fine. But if you're talking about big data and algorithms from using the Immaculate conception of data framework, you start to lose sense of that partiality, right? Of the particularness of lines of inquiry of the data sets being collected and who they then serve. So I argue that ICD is a conceptual force that actually closes down critical humanities and social science scholarship around data and AI. And we really need the kind of scholarship, I think, that folks like us do to realize technology and environmental justice. And I talk about sustainability in the book. And I think that tech justice and environmental justice go hand in hand. Thank you.
I'm going to just hope that our virtual friends can hear me. Thank you so much. My brain is going in 100 different ways. I'm rather embarrassed to ask because I have to go in a while and I've not read it yet.
Ooh, that's okay.
Who has time to read anymore?
Who has?
But one thing that I'm thinking about is I hate to use the word obvious, but like an obvious thing, me having grown up in a rural community with big farms that are probably, maybe not, but potentially not when I was a kid, but today are probably employing this technology. There must be buried within this entire system a class and racial divide. These technologies are probably catering to large white-owned farms, and then creates a larger divide or further marginalized farmers, like BIPOC farmers, who might not have the means to pay for this technology or these tools at all times, because, like many facets of our world, it creates a big economic crisis. So I'm wondering if you saw any of that playing out within these discussions.
Hard to hear you, Jada. Here, I'll come over.
I'll stand by you.
Okay.
Sorry,
The
question sort of like broadly speaking is how does this technology further exacerbate, if at all, class and racial
Inequity.
divide within the agri industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like we have someone from Real Agriculture Podcast in attendance. I can't tell who's attending, but they had this great episode on gender in Canadian farming. And yeah, the average farmer in Canada is a 56-year-old white man.
Yeah.
And the barriers to entry for farming are real, especially for new Canadians and BIPOC. Yeah, absolutely. And, so one thing I would say, as you said, I'm quite sure that these tools are kind of being adopted by the larger farms and where the rural area where you grew up. Interestingly, agricultural economists and probably folks from the government are really preoccupied right now with a curiosity, which is these tools aren't being evenly adopted, even among the large scale commodity farms. And, partly so some people think, oh, the return on investment is not proved yet. But then other people also say maybe it's a kind of digital divide, right? Maybe it is a kind of age thing, which is one barrier, right? And so, or a facility, with digital technologies that's lacking. And so maybe we need to digital skill. There's also the issue of broadband access in Canada. And that as a kind of line of critical inquiry has been thought about by the Canadian government. We need to bring broadband access to rural areas to engender a kind of the inevitable digital revolution. But yeah, this is a concern of mine. Exactly. I mean, I didn't say it, I guess, explicitly. When I mentioned the bias, I'm concerned about inequity between farmers, or really between, I guess, types of farms. And we find that if you look at the most recent census data, agricultural census, that actually market gardening and farming actually direct to consumer, mostly small scale, mostly veg, there's an overrepresentation of women and new entry farmers and new Canadians in that particular category, and the opposite is true for the large scale, you're right, commodity farm. And so that bias in the commercially available tools, some of which are being supported by Canadian, by funding from Canadian government policy and programming, has supported the private sector or private-led innovation. If there's that bias, then there's a bias, there's inequity, not just between farm strategies and farm type, but also then there's other kinds of difference that map onto that, racial and gender, absolutely. And I think you can see that in the statistics on adoption, but also the agricultural census data. My concern is also that, the smaller scale farms tend to be more biodiverse. And so they contribute important ecosystem services. Actually, in Canada, which is really surprising, small family farms are still the most numerous farm type. So they're also really important for the social fabric, of rural communities, probably the community where you, and so, so there's that issue, is that concern of mine as well with the bias, It's not just that, certain people are being left behind, if we buy into this inevitable digital revolution, and we should enable wider participation, but it's also that you're biasing toward a particular kind of food system and therefore away from particular actors, as you're intimating. Yeah.
And then further perpetuated by the way in which the government might be understanding adoption of that technology, because the audience is curated. So they're only studying potentially the people who are using the technology. And that, I'm just sort of thinking about this in the way that I speak about radio, is radio is studying its audience, but radio curated that audience. So radio's never going to understand the rest of the audience, because they're only feeding off of the people that they put there. If that makes sense.
It does. Yeah.
So it creates a long-term issue.
That
I think
exactly. Totally.
In such a fascinating way.
I like that you say long-term issue. I feel like I'm often trying to have leverage a really boring conversation, or seemingly boring, because it's such a slow burn, It's let's think about the future of food system, or let's think about the future of the environment, food system as it contributes to and is impacted by climate change, but it's not as immediate as a recidivism app putting Black men in jail, it's not as immediate, but you're right. We have to think long-term. And I think that, there's a paradigm, we might call it, that's gripped, I think, Canadian agricultural policy and extension advice and research for years, which is good farms get big and grow corn, right? So it's shared by the industry and the dominant vision for the realization of digital agriculture. So that's part of the problem. But you're right, the adoption studies don't often consider non-adopters. Some of them do. And it's the research on adoption is all over the map. And, these tools that actually have a similar, if you look at GPS and auto steer, and they've been around since genetically modified organisms. So it's a real curiosity, right? Why hasn't the digital revolution yet come to pass? Maybe it's still too new, and maybe it is the return on adoption, but I think you're right. So yeah, one of the things I did for the book is I sought out farmers who are adopting, but also not adopting, because I wanted to know why. One thing I found is that the small scale farmers who are not adopting don't really have, and actually I've been running workshops with these farmers. I just did a couple the last couple of weekends, and they don't have like serious concerns about digital technologies. They're just totally doing their own, like it's just outside of the framework of, they're doing other innovative things. I would say that there are a few people in government, and I don't think they're attending, but who listen to, silly social scientists like myself who are outside of the paradigm. And that thing you said about like the bias and I went to this person in Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada, someone who has the precision agriculture file within policymaking years ago. And I just said, from my conversations with farmers, it seems to me there's the scale bias, and like, maybe as a government, we need to be aware that, not just to funnel all the money toward the private sector, because it's really for, what about all these other farmers? And actually they developed a programming with ISED for scaling down precision agriculture based on that conversation. So there are some people who are willing to think
research like
matters. Yeah.
I mean,
Sometimes.
so much of the time we're like screaming into the like
Yes.
like we're just talking
pillow.
to each other.
Yeah. But that's
Maybe.
better to each other than a pillow.
Yeah. Do either of you?
I have a question, but if you want to go to the chat.
I don't think there's anybody who put anything.
No questions in the chat yet.
No.
So it seems like I'm hearing like one issue is kind of the black box of AI, kind of the magic genie,
Yeah.
which we see in
Right.
a lot of other use
Totally.
of AI, that like ChatGPT, where
Right.
everyone is using it, but few people understand why it
Yeah.
produces the outputs it does. So I'm wondering if that has come up, and if something like explainable AI
Right.
would kind of deconstruct this immaculate conception.
Yeah. That's a really good thought. I'm going to turn this around again just in case. Or maybe I don't know. Okay, very awkward. Yeah, so I think that if there were increasing transparency, and that's a principle, right, in AI ethics, or like the Montreal Charter, OECD, transparency and explainability, I think those are good principles. So the activist scientists, right, everything is out there in the open, right, because they share this ethos of like open data and open. But it's not the case in the private sector, and that makes some amount of sense. But there is not just no transparency around how the algorithms work or the data sets, but also what's being done with the data, right? And so I think it's kind of like social media, except in that context, right? I mean, it's basically been worked out in the court of public opinion, but there's increasing pressure for social media companies, at least around what's being done with personal data harvested online, to be more transparent. And so I think that might happen in the case of agriculture. There was just this, I don't know for like agriculture folks listening, but there was a breach where John Deere tractors were hacked by the Russians with, and then I think it was like Trimble, I forget. Anyway, and then John Deere said, "Oh, but we can shut down all the tractors. It's great. We because of the centralized control, we got this under lock and key." But I think breaches like that, people might start to see that this isn't really a totally boring domain for thinking through some of these issues and applying principles, or putting pressure on industry to apply principles of transparency. I would say though, and that would help probably, you're right, not just with the actually being able to do the critical work, but undoing some of the force of immaculate conception of data if everyday people knew a little bit more about. I have a problem with that a little bit, because it then puts the burden of proof on, right, all of us to digital skill and read, like who has time, you know, you don't have time to
No.
read academic work, let
No.
alone like, you know, become a data scientist. And even if it were like explainable AI, right? Is that really our job? I mean, maybe it's the job of folks, right? In, you know, the insider baseball conversation needs to change, I think, rather than putting the burden of proof entirely on sort of consumers and citizens. But I agree with you that that could help. One thing I think the cynical me says, there's no way we're going to have transparency in the ag sector. And Jada mentioned it, it's in the sort of description of the talk, and I didn't say it at all. But like one thing I keep trying to say is actually folks should be paying attention to agriculture, because agribusiness is like Monsanto, Bayer Monsanto now, were big tech before Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
These are the longest running oligopoly corporations. Super powerful, right? So powerful. Like we think of Silicon Valley, like Google, Apple, Amazon, and Facebook as what they have more purchasing power than every African nation, right? Yeah. If you look at the agribusinesses, they're even more powerful in terms of their sheer market share. So I'm a little, you know, what have we been able to do in terms of the regulation of social media, maybe in Europe a bit more, right? To increase transparency. And with agribusiness, I'm not super hopeful. Like they're just so powerful. And the law, like just, they're just so integrated. Yeah.
I mean, this is like one of the most important discussions to be having. This is the oldest
so.
industry.
Right. And so
known
important
to
for Canada.
human, right?
Yeah. We all
Um,
need to eat.
We all need to eat. We'd like to know where our food comes from,
Mhm.
but we'd also like to understand how the industry works. I don't know, this is just, there's nothing boring about it.
Well, thank
But
you
I
for saying
love
that.
data
Yeah. You love data and yeah.
and country music, and so there's
There's a connection to like rural areas. You know, I will say, because maybe there are people online who are a bit more hopeful or share in that optimism around precision agriculture. And in that sense, when you said like, we would like to know where food comes, you know, some people have real hopes that say data and especially AI could be used for increasing transparency in the food sector, right? Traceability, right? Like quickly shutting down a potential foodborne illness, right? By generating AI-based traceability mechanisms along the food chain. And lots of people share the hope, like the one I gave the quotation about that, right? Precision agriculture, okay, maybe it is only geared toward the big farmer, but if we can help that large scale industrial farm do things better, right? That's hope. They share that there's some, and you know, I don't not share in that hope.
yeah.
If we can change the way we're doing it, if we can amend the current system to make more judicious use of harmful inputs like chemicals, great.
Yeah.
But I think that we also need to be aware of the more fundamental things happening, right? That's not
Yeah.
fundamental reform that I think is really required for justice and an environment, but there's also other things that might be quietly happening in that these tools, just like historic agricultural technologies, are likely to just reinforce the power of these powerful agribusinesses.
Right.
And that's not so good.
Reminds me of Joy Buolamwini and like data is destiny and history lies in all of this data.
Yeah, I
Right?
don't know
Like,
that.
Oh, Coded Bias on Netflix. It's
Ah,
about facial recognition
okay.
technology, but just the general idea
Yeah.
that like all of these systems that we're using today
yes, have
are
a
built on
history.
past data.
Totally.
And so we're just perpetuating
Yeah,
systems. Like we have this idea that the data is there for good
Yeah.
and that there are ways to break out of things, but quite often, I mean, part of it is everyone is tired and overworked. And so
Yeah.
like, who has the time to like really build new systems when
I
you're in
know.
it? But like, it just
or to work
perpetuates.
outside of the system,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Like I remember after Cambridge Analytica, a bunch of my students following Elon Musk quit hashtag quit Facebook, right? And like we were all gonna like quit social media, and there was this big moment, and then now it's like, you know, look, we're all on Zoom, like, you know, and or we used whatever Respondus
Yeah.
for our teaching, and
Yeah.
it's, you know, that structurally very difficult to
Yeah.
go outside the grid
Yeah.
of the history and the political economy. You were saying something about I realized that I didn't talk about the future. Like it's in my title of my book, The Politics of the Future. And that's, I think, the biggest thing we can do actually is to stop using immaculate conception of data phrasing, like raw data, and like really
Yeah.
always highlight the people and the interests, right? And the particular lines of inquiry. or the particularities behind lines of inquiry, but also to really work against this futurism.
Right.
I use actually a book that you might know because it's a communications scholar, Carolyn Marvin, When Old Technologies Are New.
Do not know.
Oh,
that.
it's such a good book. It's about radio and like electronic media versus print media. And she in the beginning of the book, she says, right, one of the most radical things we can do is ask what stays the same.
Yeah.
Right. And it's
Yeah.
true. It's like, so that's like fundamentally what I try to do with the book, and that's what I try to highlight that I don't think anyone is really doing. Even these wonderful activists who, to be honest, like I'm on their side in terms of the food politics and the environmental politics
Yeah.
and the open innovation and the
Yeah.
open science. And yet, right, they're using this like way of framing things
Yeah.
that I think works at cross purposes because it doesn't highlight the history. Yeah, it's casting toward the future and it's talking about technology instead of people as if technology did
Right.
things without people.
Right. Which it does not do.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Well, now I have about 4 new things I need to read. I typed out everything you said. Are there any other questions? Whether virtually or in person?
Maybe there's nobody there still.
If not, then I will say everybody
Stop share.
should, at the very least, read Kelly's article on the conversation.
850
And then
words.
go buy the book. And then rewatch this video. And I just want to thank you so
Thank
much. This
you.
was, mind blowing for me. I love the way you talk about tracing data because that's the critical piece of all of this is understanding how the system was built
Yeah,
and how it continues to work is really
I still don't know.
right. Well, we don't fully know, but tracing the data gets us to like understanding the nuances of that discussion. So thank you. Thank you so much. This was really wonderful.
Thank
Have
you,
some
everyone.
yous in the chat.
Thank you.
And join us again in 2 weeks for our final session, which is Mind
wow.
the Gap with
Cool.
Julie Kamachia from the Department of Communication. So
Cool.
thank you everybody for joining us today and have a great week.